looking back, do you have any childhood memories of Silverburn?
I do. I mean, the first memory I have, I think, is of the front steps. I woke up early in the morning and came down and decided to go out. It was a sunny day, like today, and as I reached these stone steps, which are not very big steps, and they were quite doable. I think I must have been 4 or 5 years old. I heard wood pigeons in the trees, and the sound just mesmerised me. And so I went wandering off into the woods, following the sound of the wood pigeons cooing. That was definitely the front steps of Silverburn. Other memories. I remember my grandfather waving. He had a white handkerchief and he used to wave as we drove away. I think that was probably the last time I saw him. That was a bit later. And I remember at the acute embarrassment of eating dinner in Silverburn, because the maids, there were lots and lots of servants, and the maids would bring round a sort of silver bowl of vegetables, and you had to help yourself. And if you're young, you're not that big, and you have to spoon them on and take just enough without being rude, enough so that you're definitely eating your vegetables, but not so much as to be rude and greedy, because we weren't supposed to be that. And I remember actually with my sister that they had one of the very first, I think the first ever television that I saw was in Silverburn. It was a small sort of square thing, and black and white, of course. And it was a French film that we watched, which really caught me because it involved fishermen from Concarneau going off and discovering that their food supplies their tins were polluted or rotted in some way, which was poisonous. And the reason they worked it out was because the cat died, which was an absolute tragedy when you're a very small boy. So that lives in my mind as well. That was the first television. And I remember they kept my uncle's room. He was killed in the war, and they kept his room as he had left it.
Yes, it was very, very sad indeed.
It was my mother's younger brother, yeah. And the older one, of course, I then got to know very well indeed. He had one leg after the campaigns, after D-Day, and a mortar went off at his feet and blew sideways. So he survived. The others didn't.
This was your uncle?
David Russell,
David
yes.
Russell, yeah.
Sorry.
It was two terrible blows, wasn't it, at the same time, really?
Yes, and the telegrams arrived on the same day. So I was apart. God, I'm sorry that this is a moving story to tell. I should have got used to it after 77 years, but not, apparently.
I think it's a sign of how strong it must be, and I think it's important for people to hear it as well, and to hear it from you is incredibly moving.
Yeah.
So, do you remember, for instance, do you remember a summer house in the garden?
Yes.
Tell us about this summer house, because some people didn't believe that there was one. Tell us about
because it's Scotland, or Well, you could actually move it round. It was on wheels, but it was an extremely difficult thing to move. It was quite heavy, wooden built mainly, with glass on the front side. And the gardeners used to come and try and turn it, so that, depending on where the sun was, and they really struggled. It was a major heavy move to make. It was green, made of wood, dark green.
What was your grandfather like as a person?
Well, for me, he was intimidating, frankly, just as a presence, because he was so old, and such an important family figure. He was the grand old man, but he was. He was really nice in other ways. He would, every time I met him, he would give me something like a small silver, or no, not silver, silver-coloured metal penknife, for instance, which one of the things that Talis Rossi used to give to clients or customers was wee things like that, and I think I still have one of the magnifying glasses, but that they fold into themselves and be easy to carry in a pocket. That was the idea. So he used to give us those, and he also used to give us tons of paper, which we could then, make messes of, and that was really nice and very fun. And also really nice paper as well, to write on. So he was a source of gifts, but he was still a scary man to be in a room with, as I remember it. I understand from what other people have said that he had a stutter, which made him perhaps just a little bit slow to take part in social things, and but in spite of that, I know from looking a bit at the history, but I never went into the archives to check exactly. He bought out the Tullises from Tullis Russell by taking on a huge amount of debt himself personally, which was a bit dicey. Sometime over the next couple of years, he was really squeezed by the need to fund and repay that debt. But he then bought out the Tullises. I think the Tullises wanted to go and be landed gentry, which is the fate of a lot of successful businessmen in those days. There was a sort of ambition to make yourself distant from the business, which my grandfather didn't want to do, and by buying them out, he ended up as the sole owner of the paper mill, and which made him eventually enormously wealthy. But he was really a risk taker for the leveraged buyout of his partners, his ex-partners. He was also, I admire his business strategy very, very much. He was the first person to employ a degree-holding chemist. He set up he employed the chemist to set up the statistical monitoring of the paper quality as it was made. But it was essentially quality control, and then also developed into a research laboratory, and he bought an absolutely tiny replica of a paper machine. Paper machine's 100 yards long or more, and massive scale, and with tons of more stuff preparing it before the stuff actually reaches the machine. And there was a replica of this in the research laboratory, so they could do experiments at very, very low cost, because obviously to run a machine that's I don't know, a couple of yards or 3 yards wide, with a high volume of stuff, you'd waste an awful lot of stuff to make one bit of paper with the new formula. But in the laboratory they could use this, and under very realistic circumstances, which was invaluable actually. It was used a lot. He took the company around 1900 into making cable insulating paper. So it was a time when telephone cables were being built and deposited across oceans. So there was a transatlantic cable that carried the phone conversations between the continents, and the wires needed to be insulated so they didn't interfere with each other, and paper turned out to be an excellent and easily manageable insulating medium. It was also an excellent electric insulation. So it was not just the small charges of telephone cables, but the high voltage electric cables, if they're going across the sea, under the sea, the best insulation was actually oil-filled electric cable insulating paper, which he used to make.
Could I ask you about, are there any handed down stories through the generations about how things were possibly in your great-grandfather's time and so on, possibly coming from the times when the mill was in use? Anything handed down? I know it's sort of several generations and so on.
Well, my great-grandfather was the first Russell to join with the Tullises, and the reason why he was in a position to do that was because as a tenant farmer he had developed a new method for pressing oil out of flax, and it became a very successful patent. So he got considerable income from the patent, the spread of the patent all across flax making, wherever it was, and he used that money to buy a 50% stake in the business in the 1870s, I think it was, and I think it helped also that he married one of the Tullis girls, so the link was social as well. But I know that when the Tullises bought the paper mill, which was a huge site, a lot of it was bought by the government on an enforced purchase. I can't remember what they call it, for building Glenrothes. So Glenrothes is largely built on what used to be Tullis land, really, more than Russell. But there was a flax mill between the two paper mills. There were two paper mills, the Ochmuti and Rothes, and in between there was a flax mill. And so I don't know whether my great-grandfather was particularly interested in that bit. His brother, my grandfather's brother, also worked in the mill as an engineer. So some of that creative spark in engineering went down to one of the boys who worked in the mill.
I remember, and this made me think of this because you were talking about your grandfather. Can you remember how he looked, like what he wore? Because a few people have mentioned to me that they recall his silver suits, they called it.
Yes. I don't remember the colour silver, but I do. I mean, I think in the sort of pale grey impression is certainly there, and loose. He wasn't a fat man, and a lot I remember is them being loose on him, which impressed me. I mean, I think that's a nice way to wear clothes. There's lots of air. Yeah.
It's funny how several people have mentioned that.
Yes.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
We've read about your grandfather's preference for peace and quiet. And how did that come across to you as a child when you were visiting Silverburn? Did you get that feeling from him?
Not perhaps directly from him, but my parents used to be very keen that we should be seen occasionally and not heard. Actually, now that I mention my parents, I do remember in Silverburn one stay where the baths were huge, and both my parents were in this deep filled bath, and I got in as well, and I could swim. It was so huge that I was so young, I suppose. That may actually even predate the wood pigeons. So a long time ago.
So, how often would you visit your grandfather? I mean, was it something like a regular Sunday visit, or was it
No.
every now and then?
No, we lived in Oban, so it was a 3 or 4 hour journey to come across to Fife, and I remember the journeys used to be measured at 30 miles an hour in planning time. So the world was much more slow moving. So it wasn't regular at all. It was occasional that we came across to.
And what was your grandmother like?
Well, actually, she was the more intimidating one. Actually, she was quite big and quite firm, and I mean, I think her views on children were perhaps but she was maybe protecting him for his peace and quiet. But if we made a noise, she would tell us off. She would, be very firm about that's not how you behave here. So they were. I mean, when you ask about things handed down, my mother was born just a few miles further on at what is now the first hotel as you get to London Links on the right hand side. That's where they used to live before Silverburn, and she was born there in 1921.
She looked a handsome woman. On the first, saw some of the photographs.
Yes,
She looked a very handsome, strong woman. They looked like real characters, you know. Would you have attempted, for instance, sort of nip down to the flax mill when you shouldn't go? At all?
Well, we used to live. The family of which I'm one of the children used to live in not Silverburn but Corrimar, which is the house in the grounds of Silverburn. We lived for several years there. And I do remember going down with my sister. There was a duck pond in front of the house, and we were standing at the sort of weir end of the duck pond, and it must have been late autumn or maybe next spring, and we were taking enormous delight in picking up handfuls of leaves and throwing them into the water. And once I got such a big handful that in throwing it into the water, I threw myself into the water as well. And luckily, we had already thrown so many leaves in that with my tiptoes, I could keep my nose above water. And my sister, of course, screamed, and parents came down and pulled me out. And I was certainly told off that time. But I think disobedience was frowned on, for sure.
Can you have you got memories of Corrimar itself? It's in a bit of a sorry state at the moment. Can you remember being in Corrimar? What was it like?
Well, I remember once when I was 2, we got a competition going, jumping over a stool, and we decided for some reason that the stool would be best placed upside down as we jumped over it. I suppose it was making it easier, and I caught a toe and fell with. I've still got a scar on my chin where I hit that, and they got the doctor who stitched it up, but he didn't need any anti-pain thing, because I'd given myself such a knockout that I think I was properly stunned. So that is a personal story from Corrimar, but I don't remember. I actually remember my first scientific venture, which was on the gravel in front of Corrimar. I found a slug that was making a grey slug that was progressing across the grey stones, and I thought it was very beautiful, and I wanted to help it by giving it what it wanted to eat, and in order to find out what it ate, I cut it in half. To see what was in its stomach, and of course you couldn't recognise what the hell was in its stomach, and nor could I actually feed anything to it because it was dead at that point. And that was really a major blow against science for me for a long time. Scientific experiments. That was gravel in front of. So I remember foxgloves around the back. Used to pick the foxgloves and put them on my fingers. They were very beautiful. And I remember my sister having a boil on her bottom, and sort of being aired in the sunshine. So all of these are fairly young memories, because my 5th birthday was in the bed and breakfast in Oban. We moved across to Oban when I was 5, exactly 5.
Could I ask you, I know that you wanted to ask a question, this is quite a big question.
Yeah.
You have a big family legacy, family stories, family company and so on. Is it possible to say how all of that has shaped you in your relative life, in your life? Has it affected you? Because has it in any way been an influence in the way your life has progressed? It's a huge question.
Well, definitely. I mean, in the sense that in the end, my grandfather passed the chairmanship to his son David, who survived the war, and I had an enormous love and respect for him. developed over the years. Not least because he was a war hero, and then I was very much influenced against the sort of, well, it was as much against the landed gentry of Fife than as anyone else. But I really didn't enjoy coming over from Oban later on in my teens and meeting the sort of the people who run hunt balls and things in Fife. And so after university, I went very much on the left wing, very much on the left wing. So much so that when I came back once to stay at home, which was which was in Fife, by then, my mother's home, she said that if the police came looking for me, she wasn't going to tell lies. So made it very clear. She turned me over to the police if they were looking for me. I was in the left wing, and David Russell was the one person in the family who kept talking. And after, I became a shop steward and the building workers, and was a shop steward during the 17-week building workers strike in the summer of 1972, and joined a Trotskyist party to lead a revolution, and by banging my head up against the brick wall for a long, long time. They gave me a Ford van and £25 a week, which is a pretty good wage in those days, and would send me to different places where there were conflicts. So during the miners' strike of 1972, I ended up in Merthyr Tydfil, living on the front room floor of one of the miners, and collecting the workers' press being sent up. Today's working press each day was sent up by rail, so I'd collect the papers and go and sell them on the picket lines, not to make money so much as to get people talking. And when people go on strike and are on the picket lines, then they are alive, mentally alive, in a way that's not normally the case. You know, they want to talk about politics and what this is all about, sort of thing. I realised in the end that there wasn't going to be a revolution. In Britain. So I trained then as a teacher of English as a foreign language, so that I could go to China and see a real revolution. And eventually in 1974, I went to China for a 2-year stint, teaching in a language college, and that put me off dictatorship intensely, completely off. One of the theories of the Trotskyists was that and Marx and Engels, was that the revolutionary class would have to establish a dictatorship, and this would be the dictatorship of the proletariat. But actually, of course, it turned out to be the dictatorship of the party, and that everybody lived in fear. It was hideous to contemplate, really. I mean, the lives they lived. I got on brilliantly well with everybody. I spoke fluent Chinese, and we had a lot of fun, especially in the 2-hour lunch breaks. Although after 6 o'clock in the evening, nobody would talk to me at all, because they were too scared to be associated with the foreigner. So I taught myself finger-picking blues on the guitar, which I unfortunately is lost in the mists of time. I can't do it anymore. But it did cure me absolutely a revolution. So I came back, and because David Russell had continued to talk and write eventually letters, we used to correspond. Although he was convinced I was insane when I was in my Trotskyist days, and because he had so wanted to pass on the baton in the family, he offered me a job. One of my cousins and two of my brothers had been sort of allowed in for short periods of working time. My cousin, because he was he exploited the position so much that he was sacked, and my brothers, well, one brother studied paper industry engineering, so he was the one destined to take over the chairmanship of Tallis Russell, and he was so put off by the industrial relations that he saw in 6 months working in a company that made paper machines that he rejected the whole thing and went out and became a smallholder in Lancashire on the top of a hill, a few cows and things, and married a French girl and has lived in the south of France all his life, his adult life. And the final brother was advised by the chief executive of the time to study accounting, and a more unlikely person to be an accountant you would not meet. He's this sort of colourful, very sociable, heavy drinking kind of chap, and it didn't work for him, so he didn't pass his accounting exams and went elsewhere. Started his own business in the end, so my uncle now saw me as potentially his last chance to get a family person into the mill. Women, of course, there were some pretty admirably strong women amongst my cousins, but and my sister, but they were not business material, according to my uncle, who had very traditional views there. And so I was his last chance, and so I eventually became chairman of Tallis Russell, and I converted it to being owned then by all the employees in the mill, which was a kind of marrying up of the reasons why I'd become a revolutionary in the first place, to try and benefit people much more widely, and the business that I had learned. I went to Harvard Business School early on when I was working at Tallis Russell. Got an MBA so that I could see how business actually worked, really, and from what I'd learned, marrying up with what I'd learned from the miners and the building workers and the Chinese, they decided that was the kind of revolution that would actually work, which it did. It worked magnificently. The productivity just soared up. But unfortunately, the mill eventually reached the point where the mill itself was driven out of business by the vagaries of low-cost international competition and some very heavy movements in finance, money exchange, foreign currency exchange, because 50% of our sales were in Europe, and the euro collapsed, and so after running very successfully for about 20 years in employee ownership, the mill had to close, which was a terrible day. We had invested quite a lot in more specialist operations that didn't need so much capital involved in. So that company, still called Thomas Russell, is still running well in employee ownership, and they've bought a competitor that went out of business in Korea, and they've started a new manufacturing operation in China. So they do seem to be flourishing, which is very gratifying and very democratic in the way that they structure. I mean, they elect the board. All the employees elect the board, and the board appoints the managers. So the feedback process is much more direct, and the wealth gets spread much more evenly out across, because the remuneration of the chief is not as ludicrous as it has become in all the top-down companies.
It seems really interesting way in which people's almost political thinking have slowly evolved through the family over those 3 generations, 4 generations, isn't it?
Part of it, you were asking about childhood memories. I do remember as a child being taken round the mill, and I was deeply embarrassed by the deference that people were showing to the family party. You know, it was really off-putting to me as a youngster to see the way adults who were, you know, they were doing phenomenal jobs, and as far as I could see, making paper, which is, you know, it was a great skill, and yet they were sort of kowtowings to my family members, and I knew the feet of clay in all the family, as you can imagine, and so it really made me. It was perhaps one of the earliest impulses to say this should be changed.
Can I ask to go back? You talked about the fact that your grandfather and I think your uncle resisted that move to become landed gentry.
Yes.
Why do you think that was? What stopped them from going down that road?
They're sensitive, decent people, I think. There was a shyness, I think, in my grandfather, which was probably passed down to an extent. I mean, they didn't fancy being display kind of people. I think my uncle was very good at riding, and used to ride before the war in the hunts and things, and he certainly had the physical courage. But after, I mean, he did enjoy the fruits. You know, he had 3 yachts in succession, proper yachts. I'm not talking about motor yachts, and the last one was a beautiful 61-foot, specifically designed and built for him by one of the great designers. And I used to sail with him. He used to sail it up and down the west coast of Scotland, and also wider afield. So across the North Sea with him, coming back from a venture off into the Baltic, I suppose. His heroism was really reinforced for me by the fact that we ran into an enormous storm as we reached the Scottish coast, and it really was. It was measured at hurricane strength in Peterhead, which is where we were coming in, and it struck too early. He was, but he had a professional Spanish boatman, and he was the skipper, and I was there just pulling ropes and things, and we took turns steering, but the nerve of the Spanish guy went, and he tried to steer the boat onto the shore because he thought we were doomed, as it were. So, and I noticed that the lights that I had not been expecting to appear on the starboard side for hours, yet we were coming in towards Inverness. Suddenly there were lights you could see through on the starboard side, and so I asked my uncle about this, and he realised that the Spaniard was actually trying to wreck the boat, and so that we'd have some hope of clambering out onto the earth. And so he got the wheel off him and turned it back out again. But he then steered himself the whole night. So, and he was getting on by then. He wasn't a youngster. So he was quite somebody.
How would you sum up your relationship with him?
Major Russell, really love and respect. He was hugely important to me. His whole approach and his lack of aggression. He would always deal with everybody very fairly and quite gently, and that was so impressive.
Tallis Russell was always known as a great company for staff, and I'm local to the area, and people still talk about things like that. So I think it's as you talk, I can see how that's passed through the generations. And I think it's always, something to be proud of.
We're not local, we're outsiders, we're observers. And I think listening to you talk about Tallis Russell as a business and the family, what I was going to ask you was, what makes a community? And what do you think your family have done to bolster or support the community that was there and is there?
Well, I think my grandfather was impressive in terms of his orientation towards the whole community. And he used to walk through the mill every day. He would walk through, and he knew everybody on the floor. And he would. My mother used to tell a story that one chap stopped him one day and said that sort of complained that he had tried for stepping up, promotion several times, but he'd never been accepted. And my grandfather said, "Well, I never see you helping anyone." And I think that's probably typical of my grandfather, that he had that kind of value himself. My uncle, he described it himself. I'm afraid this is going to be moving again. don't know why. This maybe it was the hour and a half driving at crackpot speeds on single track roads. My uncle described his approach as love for everyone in the mill. And I don't think that's how he was brought up. I think he was brought up to be a bit of a landed gent, actually, with his hunting and fishing. He was a very keen salmon fisherman. He fought all through the war with the Black Watch, and undoubtedly, I think it was that process that made him love fifers, all fifers, which was patently what he was about. Well, at the beginning of the war, he used to say it was pretty boring, basically, because they were just doing an enormous amount of training, but they were then in North Africa and at Alamein. God, I don't know why I can't talk about these things. He was wounded at the beginning, and he was a captain, I think, at that point, and he was in a medical tent, being seen to, and he discharged, he forced the medic in charge of him, to discharge him back into the battle. And then worked all night to get, they had to take a ridge, which is key for defending against Rommel. And Rommel was obviously going to counterattack. And they took the ridge. And there was a force that was left on top of the ridge to defend against Rommel's counterattack. And only 2 officers survived. He was one. And it was 2 days before they were relieved. So he got the military cross for that. I'm sorry, I feel completely pathetic.
Don't be sorry.
But it sort of meant a lot to me all my life. His courage and for him to be so unaggressive as I knew him, and humorous and warm, and I'm sure he could tell these stories without cracking up. So
I think, David, for us, we're recording stories for building of a mill, but I think today what you have done is shone the light on people, particularly your uncle, and I think it's a massive thing to do. I think there will be many, many people who will sit here and listen to you, and it will ring memories in themselves, but in their own lives, and for you to hear, for us to hear this progress and the effect, asking you before about how all of your childhood in a way has shaped you, and your relationships with this remarkable family. And I think it's very hard to express my words about, I don't know what you feel.
Yeah,
but
I think that's what's thrown me with my questions, because they all felt so straight down the line. Do you recall your uncle playing the bagpipes?
no.
No, right. In the National Museum of Scotland, there's a set of bagpipes in a carry case with David Russell on the top. and they with an old postal sort of address saying Mackinge train station.
Uh-huh.
And so I assumed these were
Yeah, they would be him.
your uncles. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're in the collections centre of the National Museum of Scotland.
Right. No, I don't.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about before we finish?
Well, I suppose I wouldn't like to pretend that that everything was rosy in the family garden, to be honest, because I think the attitudes were very traditional, particularly about women. Actually, although we talk about my grandfather having 4 children, he actually had 5, and the first one was a baby girl who had, I think they used to call it water on the brain or something. So she was very troubled, very physically challenged, and they put her in an asylum, which I suppose was how they did it those days. And she lived until 30 years old in the asylum. And my uncle also, I said that there were some pretty feisty women who were never given a chance in business. And instead, I think he really thought underneath that his daughters should be sent to finishing schools in Switzerland and finished. And it did just about finish them. They didn't get a decent education. Their role in his eyes was to marry and run an estate or something. So I think to that extent he was tainted by growing up in the Fife gentry. And my sister was always very grateful to my father, who was a civil engineer. That there was no difference made between education for the boys or girls, and so she's bought and run and eventually sold the St. Columba Hotel on Iona for her life. Which is, that was another thing about my grandfather that really was surprising, was that he must have been a religious man, and he was the first person to commission an architect to look at the ruins of the cathedral on Iona, and think about what it would take to rebuild it, reconstruct it, and those plans obviously predate the Iona community effort run by George MacLeod, and formed part of what my grandfather contributed.